Today we're going to look at how mystical interpretations of religious texts might work in practice and in history. And we're going to do this by looking at the biblical text, the Song of Songs, otherwise known as the Song of Solomon or the Canticle of Canticles. This is essentially a love poem between two lovers where they express longing for and descriptions of each other. However, this biblical scripture has been the subject of intense mystical interpretation and inspiration. And I want to do this by approaching how both Jewish and Christian mystics use this text for their mystical ends. In the Jewish context, the Song of Songs is largely seen as an expression of love between God of the Bible, Adonai, and his people. In his book, Mysticism and Religious Traditions, the scholar Stephen Katz argues that inspiration from the Song of Songs can be seen in the Shiur Qoma, or dimensions of the body. If you've never heard of the Shiur Qoma, this is an impressive midrashic text that supposedly measures the names and the dimensions, the physical dimensions of the body of God. If that's something that interests you, I highly recommend reading God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou. In the Song of Songs, we find quotes like, "His cheeks are like beds of spices yielding fragrance. His lips are lilies distilling liquid myrrh. His arms are rounded gold set with jewels. His body is ivory work encrusted with sapphires." Of course, the referent "his" here refers to God, and the lover is speaking. Katz argues that inspiration from the Song of Songs sees the Shiur Qoma using scripture like this to give a mystical vision of God's form. Later forms of Jewish mysticism, especially Kabbalah, as expressed in the Sefer Zohar, will see expressions of the Song of Songs manifested in different ways. This can even concern how the world works, as the Kabbalist works to basically restructure reality and connect it back to the divine. In this very complex system that we cannot possibly cover in this one episode, we have a system of 10 sfirot, otherwise known as emanations, through which the One, Ein Sof, expresses itself. In this system, the divine emanation, otherwise known as Shekhinah, is portrayed as female and as being in exile. She is cut off from the other, primarily male, sfirot due to the nature of reality being shattered. This becomes immensely important for the system devised by Isaac Luria in the 16th century. So here, Katz at least argues the Song of Songs can be seen as an attempt to reunite the Shekhinah, the female aspect of reality, with the other sfirot, which are primarily male. So it's no longer just romantic poetry, but a system at fixing the entirety of existence, basically. About this form of Jewish mysticism, I will always recommend Esoterica, the work by Justin Sledge about Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, is immensely important. Now, let's turn to Christian mystics and how they interpreted the Song of Songs for mystical ends. Now, the most traditional approach to the Song of Songs is the lover, being Jesus, and his love for his church. However, Christian mystics are going to take a very personal, intimate approach to the Song of Songs. Instead of the church, the soul is the female lover. So we see, for example, in the works of Saint Teresa of Avila, "I believe God ravishes the soul wholly to himself, as being his very own and his bride, and shows her some small part of the kingdom she has thus won." Meanwhile, Catherine of Siena describes how after receiving a ring from Jesus in a vision, Jesus kissed her on the mouth, and Our Lady in the same spot and moment did likewise. And Catherine, excusing herself to Jesus that she had no words to thank him as her heart desired, only said, "My Lord, I thank thee that thou hast designed to take this wretched creature for thy bride." We cannot end this episode without making reference to Bernard of Clairvaux's 86 sermons on the Song of Songs, one of the greatest medieval exegetical exercises on this very scripture. The scholar Bernard McGinn writes how Bernard of Clairvaux uses the song in Sermon 23 to describe a way how the soul undertakes a journey to loving union with Christ. "The King has brought me into his rooms. This is where the fragrance comes from. His is the goal of our running. She, the bride, had said that we must run, drawn by that fragrance, but did not specify our destination. The bride's keen senses have been quick to detect it, so eager is she to experience it in all its fullness. Of course, such expressions of intimacy with God were not always accepted socially. In fact, one such female mystic, Marguerite Porete, was burned at the stake in 1310 for writing similar stuff in The Mirror of Simple Souls. An unfortunate extinguishing, in my opinion, of beautiful mystical writing and religious manifestation. Also, I need to clarify that my use of Stephen Katz here needs to be taken into context. And that's because Katz is using the interpretation of Song of Songs to argue against the unifying structure of mysticism. However, that is something that we discussed in the previous TeaSoteric episode about how problematic the term mysticism even is. What's important here, I think, is not only that mysticism worked heavily in Christian contexts, but that it relied on theological and scriptural ideas to develop its ideas. And that is something that modern mystics are very keen on ignoring because they will try to separate mysticism from its more traditional forms of religiosity. We're going to see how this mysticism is going to work as we progress through history. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of TeaSoteric, and I will see you very soon.